Hello, welcome to the podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, the Greater Loop. Today, our guest is fellow with CSIS, Henry Ziemer. Henry, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Today, we're going to talk about Venezuela. Two recent earthquakes have just hit the country. Maduro has just left. They're in a bit of reconstruction. Tell us from your angle what you're seeing.
Yeah. So, I think I want to begin by talking about the scale of the tragedy and the devastation. While, the origins of this disaster are geological, they're magnified many times over by the political precarity that we've been seeing in Venezuela that really is, years, if not decades in the making. So we have more than 50,000 people still unaccounted for, thousands of buildings destroyed, and a death toll that has now surpassed 2,000. But again, that's likely to continue to climb as people remain trapped under rubble. People remain, many people remain unaccounted for. And this is kind of, again, the fusion of both two unusually strong earthquakes of a magnitude we haven't seen in decades, if not a century, and a profound kind of hollowing out of the Venezuelan state that meant that, buildings were not built to withstand a seismic event of this scale. First responders from the Venezuelan side have been nowhere to be found. And there's a real, a dire humanitarian crisis. At the same time, I do want to kind of underscore, we have also seen an outpouring of support from the international community. The United States was on the ground within a matter of hours. Countries as far away as India have sent, field hospitals that can be deployed and set up to help care for survivors. I think the magnitude of the international response has been incredibly encouraging. And so we're caught between this both dramatic human need and I do think some great courage on the part of the first responders.
And additionally to the countries that are going out and being first responders, what is the response on the ground? What does that look like?
Yeah, so, the first 24 hours after a disaster are especially vital. Within a matter of hours, you need people with heavy lifting equipment. You need trained professionals to be rescuing people who may be trapped under tons and tons and tons of rubble. Unfortunately, again, because of the reasons I described, in Venezuela, that's was almost non-existent. You had people searching through rubble with their hands, right? Kind of community members mobilized to do this. And while we did see people showing up on the ground very quickly, the response, especially from the United States, has been very rapid, right? That first 24 hours is now past. And I think, some people were saying basically the remaining folks to be saved, to be, who are survivors, who are still trapped, are few and far between. And it will be exceptional cases that we're rescuing more people. Now, the mission is more one of, first of all, recovering the bodies, finding, the final casualty or death count. Second of all, addressing the tens of thousands of people who have been displaced, who have lost their homes, now are without, they may not have had safe water or a stable job to begin with, but they're certainly, lacking that now. And then thinking about long-term recovery. How does Venezuela rebuild from this and build back safer and stronger, hopefully?
Where does this leave Venezuela politically?
Yeah, there's sort of two different outcomes. I think natural disasters, on the one hand, have a way of crystallizing public, awareness of their government's failures. And in the case of Venezuela, which, as you mentioned at the beginning, is sort of in this interim government headed by Delcy Rodriguez and the remaining kind of Chavista inner circle that was governing the country under Maduro has not left. There is a chance that this provokes more public protest from the Venezuelan street and the Venezuelan civil society, kind of demanding that we see steps towards a political transition that will bring to power a government that's more responsive to the will of the people, that's more able to handle or to help rebuild. On the other hand, I think that there's a real risk as well that this actually does entrench Delcy and the Chavista inner circle because, we've seen they have declared a state of emergency. It's easy now to say, look, we've just been through this massive catastrophe. Now is not the time to talk about elections. Now is not the time to talk about democratization. Now is not the time to talk about civil liberties. And to an extent, they do have a point in that the priority has to be on saving lives and addressing urgent need. But in a much greater sense, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this crisis, the regime bears responsibility for the hollowing out of the Venezuelan state. And right now bears responsibility for, we've seen reports of security forces refusing to let aid into certain places or halting the delivery of international assistance while they check and make sure that it's not kind of disrupting their control. And I think those incidents are really, polarizing and infuriating for Venezuelans who are seeing them and who are suffering from them, and could lead to, I think, some more political pressure on the regime. So there's two directions this could go in. Right now, it's probably too soon to tell.
Right. Related to that, despite the human toll, which is terrible, so very tragic, do you think this leaves Venezuela at a geopolitical turning point?
I certainly think, I want to play out the counterfactual here a little bit, which is, this crisis, the political conditions predate the earthquake, right? And had we seen Maduro still be in power and we not see this opening and kind of bizarre or peculiar maybe relationship with the United States that has emerged over the past 6 months, Venezuela would still have humanitarian devastation, still be facing massive need for assistance, but would have a government that is an international pariah. And we can look back to 2019 when the Maduro regime was burning aid trucks at the border, at the Colombia-Venezuela border, rather than risk allowing the international community to come in, which could disrupt its sort of grip on Venezuelan society. So I do think, this is there on the one hand, of course, Venezuela's in such a precarious position. The macro factors haven't changed a whole lot or within Venezuela domestically, but the international factors have changed a whole awful lot. And this outpouring of support and receptiveness from the Delcy Rodriguez interim government is somewhat unique and not what we would have seen had Maduro still been in power.
Absolutely. And do you think the relationship between Washington, Caracas will change?
I'm not sure if it will change so much as sort of, we're still, us in the think tank space are still trying to comprehend how much it's already changed, in the sense that, again, flashback to those burning aid convoys and the, the state of play between several U.S. administrations, the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, and the Maduro government. And look now, and you see Marines, U.S. Marines deploying in La Carlota Air Base, in downtown Caracas, that was actually struck during Operation Absolute Resolve. You see, Southcom being very open and active, the U.S. military being right there at the forefront of the aid response. And that's quite jarring, I think, to me as someone who's been following Venezuela for several years, that you'd have U.S. military forces operating so actively and again, relatively freely, not saying that there haven't been tensions, but operating relatively freely within Venezuela to deliver life-saving aid. That's shocking. I don't think that's going to change, right? The U.S. has definitely been forward-leaning and trying to make Venezuela a success story and make it, a foreign policy success. I think this is, going to add brand new challenges, but it's not going to change kind of the relationship between Washington and Caracas that we're seeing forged since January 3rd.
Sure. And since I'm in Houston, Texas here, the energy center, capital of the world, how do you think this is going to affect Venezuelans' return as an energy producer?
Sure. So, the initial reports suggest that, the damage to Venezuelan oil export infrastructure has been a little less than we might have expected. Or it's been comparatively minor. And so that is, on the one hand, somewhat encouraging, suggesting that Venezuela will be able to continue its oil exports. And it's particularly necessary right now because the oil sector is really the government's only source of new funds, or only major source of new funds. And given the kind of billions of dollars that's going to be needed for reconstruction, the sooner Venezuela is able to resume large exports, the better. And so obviously, I think that at the same time, Venezuela's oil sector was decrepit and leaky and rickety kind of well before this earthquake happened. And no oil producer would say the earthquake helps, right? Mm-hmm. The risks to the infrastructure, the kind of broader societal pressures, all, still have their effect on the health and stability of the oil sector, as well as, Venezuela's overall kind of attractiveness for foreign direct investment, right? If you thought that Venezuela was kind of a risky market for foreign direct investment before, it's way more risky now. And that will have, I think, a clear effect on Venezuela's ability to, rebuild some of the oil infrastructure, rebuild some of its, the physical export infrastructure, because the immediate priority has got to be on kind of addressing the water, sanitation, and housing needs of the Venezuelan population. So it's going to further defer a lot of the investment that needs to go into the oil sector is, I guess, what I would say. A bit of a roundabout answer there, but so far it seems like the initial effect has been relatively minor, but the macro effects could be much greater.
Do you see any impact on the whole of Latin America?
Yeah, I'd say like one of the more interesting things that I'm tracking is I've mentioned this outpouring of support, and we've seen in Latin America the rise of several governments that are more U.S. aligned, more pro-U.S., and have been racing themselves to provide support to Venezuela. So El Salvador was another, country that's been very forward-leaning in terms of providing first responders, helping rescue people from the rubble. And I think, in my opinion, this is a test of not only, U.S.-Venezuela relations, but this kind of coalition of countries that the U.S. has kind of been spearheading in the form of initiatives like the Shield of the Americas. How can the new kind of conservative or pro-U.S. wave, whatever you want to call it, how can that work together to kind of be more than the sum of its parts in providing assistance to Venezuela, which is sort of, again, there's a lot of debate about where Venezuela falls exactly, but it's sort of an honorary member, I guess I would say, of this Shield of the Americas grouping, of this pro-U.S. Kind of coalition of countries in the Western Hemisphere. So that's where I would see is, this is going to be a real test of regional integration as well.
And they've just announced debt restructuring is going to happen this week. They have a lot going on. How do you think Venezuela will look in the years to come?
Yeah, so right, Venezuela, actually the same week that the earthquake struck, announced that it was seeking to restructure $240 billion of debt. That's about, $80 billion more than people were expecting. The largest sovereign debt burden in history, as I understand. I think, the earthquakes only complicate that situation further because there's no way Venezuela rebuilds without taking on more loans, right? Taking out, getting financing from somewhere. The government simply doesn't have the resources on hand to do anything, in my opinion, remotely equivalent to the scale of the rebuilding project. So, that's complicated when you already have the largest sovereign debt we've seen in history. And how that works out, I think, is going to be, again, a real test of the United States, of how much money, it's one thing to provide immediate humanitarian aid. It's another to try and kind of financially or macroeconomically rebuild an entire country. And that's really the task at hand. So how the U.S. works with agencies like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the Inter-American Development Bank to get Venezuela additional, financial assistance as it's going through this debt restructuring, that's going to be a real, probably a tall order, but it's going to be absolutely critical to the long-term outcome of this.
Well, I know you and I, our thoughts and our prayers are with the people of Venezuela. We're hopeful that they can still recover more people. Henry, thank you for joining us today. It's been our pleasure to have you, and thank you for the update.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on.